So please welcome Mark Carlotto.
Thanks, Catherine. It's so nice to be here. It's so nice to see faces I haven't seen in a while, between COVID and everything else. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for asking me to speak. And so you had three, I'm sure, wonderful, well, four talks, I think, previously, right? Addressing different aspects of Dogtown, and I hope there's not any redundancy here. My stuff is kind of scattered, so it's likely there'll be some new things here. So I'm talking more about places and times, things that you could sort of tie to the landscape, because that's what I think, for me, is what Dogtown's all about. Being able to see history, literally in your backyard. So, the interesting thing about Cape Ann is you look at a map and there's all these little hamlets and towns and roads all around the outside. What's going on in the middle? What is there? Is it a waste dump? Why is it off limits? Is there nothing there? This is really apparent from the air. That's, to me, as an aerospace engineer, you see things from the sky, from satellite imagery. It's like, what are you looking at? And you'd never know what was there looking at this image. You think there's really nothing there. But, there's quite a bit there. And so what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about the sort of the infrastructure, in a sense, the physical infrastructure, the old roads of Cape Ann, of the island Cape. Then talk a little bit about the woodlands and the early settlement, how that might have happened. Try to visualize that a little bit with some graphics. Talk a little bit about cellar holes. A lot of photos here. I have about 50 slides, so I'm going to be tearing through, and I'm not going to be saying a whole lot, so we can talk more later. But I want to get through this in less than 3 hours. It probably, I'm sure, will be fine. Then I'll talk about sort of what happened from the early settlement, from the common settlement to Dogtown, because these are really two different things. Then talk about the municipal property, which is what Dogtown is today. And related to that, a piece I wrote in a blog that I set up a few years ago, friendsofdogtown.info, and I wrote an article entitled "The Fate of Three Places in Dogtown, a Cautionary Tale." And I'll summarize from that, and the article and several other articles are online that you can take a look at and read if you're interested. So with that, let me get going. The old roads. Here's a section of Common Road, east of the Goose Cove Reservoir, as you're heading out to Whale's Jaw. And again, you look at this map and there's nothing there. However, John Mason's map in 1831 drew a number of roads and footpaths, a lot of amazing detail in this map. Locations of old farms, of dams, of mills, and so forth. And so obviously in this map there's a lot going on in the middle there, but that's not evident from the air. I spent about 10 years mapping Dogtown. I was kind of in the right place at the right time. GPS and mapping technology was just becoming available. Now everyone's creating amazing maps, and I was going out every day and with my Garmin GPS and mapping and using some software I wrote, putting it all together, which eventually I was able to display here in using Google Earth. And what this shows is my representation, and I know it's incomplete because people have done more mapping more recently. But what it shows are basically the linear feature of the road infrastructure in the middle of Cape Ann. The yellow lines are the old roads. And if we go to the Mason map, I transferred the roads from the Mason map, and so you can kind of see how they correlate. And it's pretty interesting. The Mason map cartographically wasn't terribly bad. 1831. I mean, some of them are pretty close. Some of the others. Let's see, do I have a pointer here? Yeah, I do. Yes.
Could you just point out on that map, show people where we started for our walks this morning?
Oh, sure. Where did you start?
Squam Road, top of Squam Road down to Whale's Jaw.
Yeah, so Squam would be right.
It's the yellow one, up to, right, go to the left. It's right there, there you go, right there, down to Wales Jaw. So we went right down.
Oh, right,
straight
right,
to the
right.
left, to where it meets the green line. And that junction with the, no, that the other way, south. There you go, right there.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
Right
yeah.
there, right
Right.
at the heart of Cape Ann.
Right.
That's where we went this morning.
I live over here, and my favorite route to Wales Jaw used to be to loop around this way, take this trail here,
Yep,
come around
that
and
way.
come back this way.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So the yellow roads are the yellow lines are the old roads. The green are the bulk of the trail system, post-dating the settlement. Not clear when they were first cut or blazed. The other interesting thing are the red lines are some of the city roads, some of the service roads like around Goose Cove Reservoir and other places. And then the orange lines, mostly up north, are the old quarry railroad, the track beds that are now trails. Yeah, okay. So Thomas Wentworth Higginson wrote this, it was about 50 years after Mason's map. And he talks about, it's his description of the interior of the Cape, and I won't read it all, but he talks about this network of footpaths, rarely passable for a wagon and not always for a horse, but enabling the pedestrian to go from any one of these villages to any other in a line almost direct and almost always under an agreeable shade. And when you read this and you think about roads and what what the colonists built, it doesn't really jive. And Mary Ellen had put this map together in one of her papers, unpublished papers on Cape Ann prehistory, and it plots all of the native sites on Cape Ann, those little donuts. And if you look at them, it's interesting. They all seem to be correlated with this network of footpaths. And it's a hypothesis. I don't know if you could test it any other way. It seems plausible, but it seems like perhaps these footpaths were originally native, that the colonists, co-opted. Some of them, obviously, they turned into major roads like, Granite Street and Route 27 and Washington Street and so forth, going around the Cape. But the others in the middle are still there. They were used by the colonists for some period of time, and now they're abandoned, but they're still there, and they're out there, waiting to be discovered, rediscovered. Anyway, so a whole other chapter is on Lanesville and the quarry railroads and what happened there in the 1800s. Les Bartlett is an expert on that, and I'm sure you'll be seeing him lately, and he'll probably have a lot to say about that. That's an important chapter in the spatial history of Cape Ann. That came after Dogtown. So going back, rewinding, it's like movies nowadays, nothing is linear, we're always jumping back and forth. So common woodland and settlement. Champlain map that Mary Ellen talked about, showing this largely wooded area. I mean, is it cartographically accurate? No. Is it thematically accurate? Probably not, but you kind of get an idea. There were woods and there were farms and there were villages. So what I did is I created sort of a notional visualization of how the Dogtown might have first sort of started. So pre-colonial, you have, it's largely wooded. There's all these low-lying marshy areas, remnants of the glaciers 20,000 years ago. And this is, looking sort of eastward from like around Goose Cove Reservoir. That's actually Goose Cove down here. I keep losing my cursor. Anyway, down there. So mid-1600s, the colonists came to Gloucester. One of the first industries was lumbering. They decimated the forests. Hardwood was exported for ship masts and for ship building, and also cordwood for the colonists for heat and cooking. And a lot of the woodlands were cut down. And so there was a limit placed on the amount of wood you could cut. And then shortly thereafter, land grants were issued to native-born residents, 6-acre grants, I believe they were. And so researching who got the grants and roughly where they are, I attempted to kind of correlate them with what's on the ground today. And if we look at the stone walls, I don't know, can you see the black lines there okay? Anyway, you can see the correlation between those plots and the stone walls. And so they're not all of the land grants. There are many of them. But some of them you can actually correlate with stone wall boundaries, property boundaries, that have settlers' names associated with them that are the same settlers that received, or descendants of the settlers that received those grants, those land grants. So this is a settlement circa 1740 along, and this is looking east, so on the right is Dogtown Road, on the left is Common Road, and then they come together and they head up towards Whale's Jaw to the left. This map was made possible in part, or originally because of a map drawn by Josiah Batchelder in 1740, and it was a map of the first parish at the time, of the northern part. Mary Ellen mentioned about how the population moved to the harbor, and this was related to the splitting of the first parish. And because of this information, later Roger Babson was able to figure out who lived where, and he drew this map in the early 1900s, and listing various names. These are early settlement as well as Dogtown settlers' names, so it's kind of the mixed bag. And actually, I'll talk. Oops, keep going the wrong way. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But together with that information, and then, oh, sorry, oh no, that's not right. Okay, sorry, I spaced out. So that's the Batchelder map. This is the map drawn by Charles Mann in The Story of Dogtown. And these are the later settlers, as well as a few early ones. But this is based on the oral history. And my point in showing you this is, based on this, I was able to take this, integrate it with GPS locations, and figure out exactly who lived where and when in the original settlement, and then later on in the common settlement that became known as Dogtown after the Revolutionary War. So the cellar holes. Classic picture of a house over a cellar hole, a simple wood frame house, chimney in the middle, 2 rooms generally, and a root cellar under half the house. And the house is gone, but what remains is what we can see in Dogtown today are these root cellars. The earliest ones, meaning from the common settlement, so the ones that were built in the late 1600s, early 1700s, seem to be the best built ones. They're built with large stones. They're well positioned. They're not cut. They're field stones, and they've survived intact pretty well. Later cellar holes built in the Dogtown area. This is a cellar hole on Dogtown Road, just past the gate as you're kind of heading up Dogtown Road. And there's brick, and there's a lot of rough stones in it. It's not made as well. And it just kind of, it's sort of like reminded me of how the early pyramids in Egypt are much better built than the later ones. It's like there was a de-evolution or a decline in the technology. I mean, clearly that didn't happen here, but it implies that maybe the later residents didn't put the same care and attention into construction that the early ones did, because the early ones were the sons and daughters of the settlers who lived in other parts of town, who chose to live in Dogtown. This is a historical photo of the Pierce cellar, or Purse. People correct me, it's like you don't say Pierce, it's Purse, I believe. Is that right? Purse, yeah. Pearce. Anyway, one of Fred Bowden's historical photos that he purchased, amazing collection. This is a view looking looking east, and so that's the Pierce cellar in the foreground, and there's some other cellars that are that would be in the direction of, well, so let's say looking east towards Dogtown Square. At this time, this is the early 20s, it was an open landscape. And, in contrast to what you see here today, you really got to hunt for these things. And once you get to them, they're very difficult to get into and explore, and even to really see for that matter. I have an app called Metascan. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a 3D scanner, and you can go around and you can actually create a 3D model of these things. And it kind of works, but it's so distracting because you have all these little branches everywhere. They say there's software to remove them so you can actually get the model of the cellar. But these are really overgrown, and it's great that we have pictures like this so we can see what it was like, what the landscape was like back in the time of Hartley and Sloan, and the ones that were painting these amazing glacial landscapes. So these are the cultural features that were behind them when they were painting these spectacular boulders. This is what would have been available to see walking around. The vestiges of Dogtown and the common settlement. These are the stairs of the Pierce cellar going up. So they're still there. So fairly early cellar, pretty well built. And I mentioned John Babson earlier. John Babson and Roger Babson, and Roger, among his many contributions, was labeling the cellar holes in Dogtown using the information in that earlier map I showed. This is actually Babson's map. I moved some charts around just before I gave this talk, and I think I screwed up my thinking about him. Anyway, so this is the Babson map that he drew in the 20s, and largely based on the information in Batchelder's map, showing who lived where. And what's cool about this, it's not just a map, but the numbers correspond to the numbers on these boulders, so you can actually go there. So by cross-referencing it, he gave us a way now of really being able to access and sort of preserving this information in a way that maybe otherwise would have been very difficult to preserve. So rather than talk, my third book, Cellar Speak, and Catherine was so kind to talk about my books. I've written 3 books because I thought when I wrote the first book I'd get it right, and people would say, no, that's not right. So then I had to write another book, and after 3, I still think I'm probably maybe 95%. I don't know. Dogtown is tricky. There's a lot about it I think that you probably can't know. But one of the things I wanted to do in the third book, in Cellar Speak, was put genealogy and mapping together. So I had been doing a lot of mapping, trying to figure out who lived where. But then back around about 5-10 years ago, a lot of genealogy data was becoming available on the internet. And a lot of these people that lived in Dogtown, you could actually find information. You didn't have to be part of their families and do, Ancestry.com. It was actually available. And so I was able to actually create sort of like social networks. And I'm going to talk about something very specific in a minute. But the one thing I discovered, it was probably pretty obvious. This is a way of visualizing spatial data that puts things that are closely related next to each other. And the relation is, did the person in this house, did their daughter marry their son? That sort of thing. And this, you see this actually, I live in Riverdale, and a lot of families still live in the same neighborhood. And people, it's changed obviously now, but you see in Dogtown, this quality that there wasn't a lot of, you weren't getting out a lot. It was before the bridge. And, you know, Gloucester was a very isolated community, right, for a very long time, right? And so, so you see this coming, when you correlate the genealogy with the map data, you get these representations. And it's sort of like you kind of interacted with your neighbors, which is maybe obvious in retrospect, but it was kind of an interesting discovery, or an interesting thing to see.
Mark, those numbers went all the way back to when people lived there. Was that for the town administrators for mail delivery, or?
I'm sorry, these numbers are the numbers that, in Babson's map.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So what was the reason for it?
For the numbers?
Yeah.
Well, it was just to label. Babson, when he was a kid, his grandfather took him into the woods and showed him, you know, and he spent a lot of his time, his formative years, and when he got older, among his many projects, he wanted to identify these for posterity.
You're talking about the 19th century, right?
Yeah, I'm talking about, the early 1900s, yeah. 1920s, I believe.
He was born in the 1870s, I think.
What's that?
I think he was born in 1875.
Yeah, and he did this work, and in fact, Les Bartlett has researched, he has a lot of the original manuscripts that Babson published on this. He's been really good in identifying some of these early works. His presentation of the Rotary Club in Gloucester, where he talks about this map. Anyway, I digress. These numbers are Babson numbers, cellar hole numbers. Okay, so common settlement to Dogtown. Common settlement was the original colonial settlement. It was part of Gloucester, like any other part, but it was up north. It was away from the harbor, and as like Mary Ellen mentioned, when the economy changed after the Revolutionary War, people moved from uptown to the harbor, and Dogtown, or the common settlement, was abandoned. It became Dogtown. Roger Babson sort of saw this in a more of a broad perspective, and his view is that the best families lived in this portion of Cape Ann. He loved Dogtown, and he saw it as a good thing. His predecessor, John J. Babson, in his History of Gloucester, his opinion was completely the opposite. It was like, this is, you know, the only people that lived here were people that, they lived here because the land was free, and he didn't really respect them very much at all. In fact, so much so, in Babson's map, John J. Babson's map in his History of Gloucester, Dogtown is up there. There's no settlers up there, but there's settlers everywhere else. There were people living there, but he just chose to ignore them. He chose to ignore the indigenous population as well. He says very little. Pringle says more about the indigenous population, but it's like, you know, you think history is objective, but everyone has their own filter on it, right? So the case study I want to talk about with Dogtown, that kind of talks the genealogy and the mapping, sort of puts it together, is the story of Peter Lurvy. Mary Ellen showed an artifact from his cellar. Peter Lurvy was killed in the Battle of Gloucester, fighting the British warship Falcon in Gloucester Harbor. And Joe Garland's book is amazing. I just recently, it took me years to finally come around to reading the whole thing. It's fantastic. It's hard to get. It's too bad. Everyone should read it. Everyone who lives in Gloucester should read this book, because the role that Gloucester played in the Revolutionary War was it just blew my mind. I had no idea. Peter Lurvy was killed in the early days of that war. Peter Lurvy is shown here in this ancestry chart. His father was Peter Lurvy, and I'll probably have to go back and forth. This is where his father lived. This is the Stanwood cellar. This is in the middle of the woods, in the middle of Dogtown, really hard to get to. One of the old cellars, you can see, again, the very fine construction there. It's very straight, upright wall there. What happened to the house? It's on the corner of Reynard and Washington Street. Actually, not exactly on the corner, but up one. They dismantled it and they rebuilt it. So that's where Peter Lurvy's father lived. Peter Lurvy moved from there, and I'll have a chart that kind of shows the movement. He moved to this cellar, cellar 25, across in the Wharf cellar, actually. Wharf was the character, and I think he's in the play tonight, one of the characters. that, noted for committing suicide, kind of one of the darker aspects of Dogtown, but, who knows what was going on back then. Imagine what it was like living here. And that's, for me, that's what this whole Dogtown experience is. It's getting out of your shoes, you're putting your devices away and getting out and seeing things in a different way, in a way that, without any of the technology. And how did they live here? So anyway, I have this map. It's a little complicated, but the Stanwood cellar is up here where his father lived, and then they moved to cellar 25 here. And this kind of gives you an idea of some of the movement that took place in Gloucester, in this part of Gloucester, over about 100-year period. And I'll talk more about this in a little bit. But what happened, Peter Lurby was called to action. He was killed, and his wife and daughter continued to live in the house. And then eventually, his daughter married John Morgan Stanwood. And that other family tree is down here. It's the lower one. I can't seem to point to it with this. And when they got together, they lived first in the parents' house, and then they moved to cellar 30, which is generally the rock is underwater at Goose Cove Reservoir. So if you walk in and to the parking lot, and there's the service road, you go across it, there's this giant boulder that you see there that's always above water. But when the water's really low, there's another one, number 30, and that's where the cobbler shop, that's where John Morgan Stanwood lived with his wife. And the reason I bring this up is that this is Gloucester history. This is part of the literature of Gloucester. The poem Morgan Stanwood, written by Hiram Rich, that talks about Morgan Stanwood, patriot. Well, it turns out Morgan Stanwood was really Peter Lurby, and he talks about where he lived, which was here. This is cellar 9 on Dogtown Road. This is the Clark cellar. So Rich's poetry is rich in imagery, but it's not factually correct. The characters were wrong, the places were wrong, and this is sort of the challenge that you face when you're trying to understand Dogtown, because, for me at least. But anyway, you sort of get the picture, and this was supposedly the footstone or the entry to the Stanwood to Peter Lurby's house, but it was, again, John Morgan Stanwood. So this is actually kind of a cool place. So you read the poem, and you read about the doorstep, and it's like you can go here and see this. You can read about Peter Lurby and go to his cellar. You can go to these places in Dogtown. If you turn around, what you look at is this. You look at the compost facility. And so let me talk about the municipal property. So Dogtown, and the whole history of the municipal property is a talk in itself. There were, there's the Dogtown Preservation Commission now. There was the Dogtown Advisory Commission. There were, Friends of Dogtown, Cape Ann Trail Stewards, a lot of people, and this is just recent. Over the years, there's been a lot of people involved in Dogtown and preserving it, or on one hand, or wanting to develop it on the other. But it really all started in 1930 when the city ran out of water. At that time, all the water was coming from West Gloucester, from the reservoirs, from dikes, and from, what's the other one? Haskell. And water main break I think it was under the harbor, and suddenly the whole island had no water. So what happened was Babson, Roger Babson and his family, his grandfather Gustavius, sold the city, deeded the city, a huge parcel of land to build the Babson Reservoir. This is the Babson Reservoir looking west. This is a similar view in a painting by John Sloan. And this was before Babson's time. But it gives you an idea of the landscape. So what happened, the city purchased this land. Within a year, the reservoir was constructed. It's amazing how how quickly things got done back then. Imagine now, we'd still be waiting. We'd be dying of thirst. Anyway, so a huge parcel of land was given to the city by Babson for the reservoir and the watershed, which is shown here. In '63, a second reservoir was built in Goose Cove, and that's also an interesting story, how that happened. And together you can see, well, why is Dogtown largely undeveloped? Why is this part of the Cape largely undeveloped? It's because of these reservoirs in the watershed. It's because it's municipal property. So it's a good thing. Babson, in the process of, part of his agreement with the city was the city would let him continue to do his, called it a civil works project, the Babson Boulders. He hated graffiti. He hated other people's ideas, but he felt he had a right to put his philosophy in the stonework. And, the guy had, he's one of the, I would love to meet Roger Babson. It would be a character for sure. Anyway, and the other thing, again, that he was doing at the time was the project with labeling the cellar holes. Actually, that preceded that when he was younger. But where I'm getting around to talking about is we have these reservoirs here, and notice there's this area in the middle. Now up north, there's a lot of stuff going on up north. We have forestry land, we have conservation land, and Cindy and Chris and people like Charlie Crowley, they know all about, and Nick Holland, they know all about how this is developed and the status of that. But the critical thing that I want to talk about is not up there, but what's going on down here between these two reservoirs, which is shown here. And I want to do it in the context of what I call a cautionary tale. I don't want to be too dark, but, I mean, you see the handwriting on the wall. This is, after sort of the Friends of Dogtown sort of fell into, I don't know, I'm not sure what the word is. After, COVID and we lost a lot of steam. That's why it's so good kind of seeing you guys here, because it's been a long time since I've seen a lot of you. But in the meantime, I set up this blog to put up some, information, documents that weren't necessarily available. They may be now, because the DPC has been doing a lot of work and making a lot of information available. I also wrote a couple of pieces that sort of maybe somewhat opinion pieces, but one is called The Fate of These 3 Places in Dogtown. So anyway, you can go online and read this. It's friendsofdogtown.info. So going back to the Clark cellar, if you want to find the Clark house, it's not there. Where is it? You walk around the back, and there's this is back a few years ago. It's a pile of stumps. Well, the city had decimated that hill. What they do is for whatever reason, they go in and they bulldoze and they take areas and they use the material, the rock, the gravel. And so this is the Clark property. So, somewhat famous place in Dogtown, it's kind of gone. This is a house actually on Guy Avenue. Some call it the Castle. It's not the Castle in Rockport. This is the Gloucester Castle. And it's an example of a 2-story wood frame house that might have been like the house built here. And this is where Easter Carter lived. Easter Carter was the last of a long line of residents at a house at this location. Existed for over 100 years. And this is just before, this is as you're going up Dogtown Road before you get to the spot where Hartley did his Gloucester Outward Bound painting. There's that rock outcrop there. Just before that is on the right is this. And it's, you go up this hill, and again, what happened to the land? The back of the hill is gone. It's like it's like a crater there. And again, another example of the city using the materials, and there probably would have been a lot of interesting historical, archaeological information there, but it's gone. And I'm just touching on these. These are talked about in more depth in the article. The other one I mentioned that I want to mention is Judy Rhines, because I know she's one of the like more colorful characters that often appear in a lot of the plays and poetry and writings. And Judy Rhines lived. This does not work, but you see R&T right next to the reservoir. These lines, the dotted lines are showing relations between people, and the solid lines are movements of people from one cellar to another by way of descendants. So their kids got married, they lived there, and then they moved to another house. So Judy Rhines actually, for a time, lived at the Stanwood house. I'm sorry, she didn't live there, but, she moved in with Liz Tucker, and then later on, the story goes that Neil Finson, who was living in the Stanwood house, came there and moved to that house. But anyway, so it's one of those places, one of those cellars. If you could excavate it, there's probably tons of artifacts you would think, just given the history of Dogtown. But if you go there, this is I'm hot, and even my maps are. I'm getting tongue-tied with my own maps, and so Duck Dodger's expressing my sentiment. This is that land. It's right along the surface road of the reservoir, and when the city built this in the 60s, there were tremendous amount of material being moved around and disruption. The cellar is probably covered over. There's boulders everywhere. But it's like amazing what might be under there. So I mention this because there's a lot of history out there, and it's history that could be lost. And if we plot the cellar hole locations over these two watersheds, these are the protected areas, we have this area in the middle where there's a lot of stuff that's not protected. This is the map of what are called self-help parcels. These are parcels purchased with money provided by the state to provide a minimal amount of protection. And again, I'm not an environmentalist, and there are many people here that know more than I do, but the point is that the intent was to take these off of the block for development and preserve them. And these parcels contain, a lot of, well, you can see where the cellars fall. A lot of them are in this area. If these were ever developed, if Dogtown Road was ever expanded, and whatever, you can only imagine what someone might build there, this would all be gone. And again, this sort of more directly correlates that with the map. So what's important about these is that they get taken off of, that the city has no option ever to develop it. Right now with the Article 97 protection, even though they're protected in their current state, they could be swapped out for a parcel somewhere else in Gloucester. If someone, say some developer came along and got the ear of the mayor and the city council was like, hey, I want to put this great development in, this Dogtown Acres development right up the middle of Dogtown, they could technically do it. There's a legal way for them to do it. And my hope is that the Dogtown Preservation Commission, among other things that they're doing, makes it impossible for the city to ever do that. To make the city add a much higher level of protection to those parcels. And hopefully that'll happen. Because if it doesn't, I'm afraid that that a lot of history could be lost. This is sort of how I see this sort of sums up my feelings that Olson saw Gloucester as a microcosm of the world, expressed so eloquently in his poetry. Dogtown is a microcosm of Gloucester. And it's there, it's still there. And you can go there and they take us back to these early times in our history. And going into Dogtown, we can visualize what it was like to be there hundreds of years ago. Where else can you do that? But if this area is developed, what do you have left? So I think it's really important. And I want to be positive, and I hope, I'm optimistic that, things will work out, but we have to, be diligent and just be aware of these facts, that, you know, Dogtown is not protected, it's in danger. Not to be an alarmist, but you just have to be sort of measured in your caution and hopefully, you know, develop a plan to mitigate some of these concerns. Anyway, that is my talk. Did I run? How am I doing for time?
You're fine. You're fine.
Is it exactly 3:44? Oh my God. Okay, thank you.